said, just already underway. It's just going to speed it up because that fracturing of people, the different beliefs, that's more so the internet than the larger conversation.
Exactly. I think again it's the same thing. So take something like fake news, right? And Russian this whole theory of Russian internet bots spreading lots and lots of fake news stories during 2016 election. Okay, which did affect people's belief systems, and they wound up believing some of them, and that wound up changing their vote. At least that's the theory, right? The interesting thing is what happened is just like the Paul example earlier. In this example, in 2016, we didn't have deepfake technology readily available. So some poorly paid internet troll had to actually type these articles. They had to type them. They had to make these up and type them. And then they just use Twitter or Facebook or something to just distribute them widely. And they use the Twitter or Facebook's already existing user classification technologies, user adaptive technologies to decide which videos to show to which people who are more likely to be vulnerable. This happened in 2016. What's going to change now is you don't even need poorly paid trolls. You can just need one troll who just switches on the the program that just generates these stories. GPT-3 right now can be given a prompt and it will make a story. And it's not necessarily anywhere near completely gripping stories right now. But again, much of the fake news that people wrote, if you read it, you'd be shaking your head saying, are there people who believe this nonsense? How can it make sense? It's not even good grammar and still falling for it, etc. When people are ready, they'll fall for a lot of things. And so, this sort of deepfake technology can make the production much faster. So in particular, the videos are going to be much easier. In the last time around, they essentially depended on news stories with one or two photoshopped images in the news story. Now I can have a video, click on the video, I will show you exactly how this so-and-so politician engaged in this really, scandalous behavior. And, and then of course we believe our eyes, and so it's going to be a, much bigger issue that way. Okay.
Yeah. And going off of the AI generated fake news stories that you talked about in your talk, you said 75% of people believe those stories that were written by AI?
This was actually old news already, honestly. This was almost 9 months back or 6 months back, I don't remember exactly. Wall Street Journal did a study, obviously, again, these are polls. They took some random set of individuals, they showed stories written by AI system versus stories written by humans, and they just looked at whether they believe the story. And more than 75% of their random population basically thought that the AI generated stories seemed reasonable, seemed actually, they didn't think that that was a fake story. They assumed it's just like any other story. So they couldn't tell the difference, And this was actually, they were using at that time older technology, GPT-2 technology. And now we have GPT-3 technology. The only difference between GPT-2 and GPT-3 is one was basically it was trained on, the newer one is trained on a lot more data, and it has a lot more parameters in the network that basically it uses to sort of look for patterns in the data. So the more parameters in the network, in essence, in some sense, when you say you have a bigger brain versus smaller brain, what we really mean technically is that in some sense you are able to learn certain classes of patterns that somebody with a much more impoverished brain cannot. And GPT-3 essentially has a lot more parameters. And when you're showing a lot more data to it, there exists, this is essentially the classic case of infinite number of monkeys typing, and will Shakespeare come out of their typing? And it turns out that if there may be 10,000 monkeys, it may not be that great. In fact, I remember this beautiful cartoon where these infant monkeys are typing away, and then they come up with this thing, and then the guy the boss looks at them and say, "It's good, but this looks more like Chaucer than Shakespeare." And he sends them back. Right? So as you see, increase the number of monkeys, which is basically the number of parameters and the amount of training they had. In essence, you can capture a lot more of the pattern, and that is enough. When then you give this to gullible people, most of us are reasonably gullible at this point of time. We are quite vulnerable for these kinds of things right now. They will believe it.
And,
Okay.
and then, so I guess in a way, quality across the board with these things doesn't necessarily have that much of an impact on whether someone's going to believe something or not. Is that
to some extent? It depends on how likely. Again, this is the what is this thing called there's a particular bias, which is it's like you already believe it. And so because you believe it already, you're more likely to need less evidence. So your prior beliefs, let's say that politician X is a bit of a liar. Then you show an extremely grainy video which has that politician saying something that sort of sounds like a made up story. People who have a prior, basically thinking this guy is actually a liar, are more likely to think, yeah, look, that completely tells me that this is enough. This is again, actually, this is Bayesian statistics. Prior beliefs, would be used along with the evidence to get your posterior beliefs. And so if you have prior beliefs already, then you might need less of an evidence. If you are skeptical to begin with, you might need a lot more of an evidence. If you believe the complete opposite, you might need even more of an evidence to be dragged into believing that this person. So the same guy earlier, if this guy thinks that the politician is a liar, and I'm trying to show a video where they actually told an uncomfortable truth, they're going to believe that, oh, that's just a fake video. He can't tell the truth if his life depended on it. And so they might need a lot more evidence to actually believe that this is real. So, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. So I guess it's more about who's your audience then.
Indeed, yeah. Now, one of the interesting things is A, that is true, and then B, again, this is where the scale becomes important. Making one forgery was hard enough when you were in the oil painting days. Making 18 different Photoshop or 100 different Photoshop images, it becomes easier. One for circulation in US, one for circulation in India, one for circulation in something else, such that the backgrounds are manipulated, such that Indians think it's again natural background, natural faces, etc. Everything. And that is still possible in the Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop era. Making one for each person you are interacting with, that will become possible with the AI technology, right? Because this is the worrisome thing. I believe there is this beautiful book of Shoshana Zuboff. I have to remember the name. Which basically it's about attention economy and how all these technology companies have very big models of your belief systems based on the fact that you spend all your life on the Facebook or Twitter or whatever. They already have a pretty good sense of whether you believe this politician is a liar versus not. And so you can use the user profile to generate the fake that the user is going to fall for. These have been called in essentially in security scenarios, it's been called the spearfish attacks. So this is an attack that just works on you, okay? A general attack basically is remember before the deepfakes, one of the things was the spam mails where essentially Nigerian king will be dying and leaving you $40 million. In the first time you might think maybe there's a possibility, but then when you find that this guy is leaving the same 40 million to all your friends, you start discounting the possibility. But if I make it something very specific to you that you are more likely to fall for, right, then it's a spearfish attack. And people, again, in generating spearfish attacks actually takes more time. I keep telling people that there's this old movie by Paul Newman and Robert Redford called The Sting, which is like the greatest movie ever. From that perspective, the entire movie is a sting. It's essentially spending 6 months making your mental model change such that you start believing in a certain thing, and then I exploit it. Right? That's a clear-cut spearfish attack. Spearfish attacks typically take even more time to construct. And again, as the technology becomes, readily available, and as you have easily available user profiles, which we never had before, but unfortunately, since you agreed to be on the Facebook, and Facebook is basically looking at every little thing you do, they have a profile on you. And if Facebook allows any random third party to send you advertisements using these profiles, then you see all sorts of interesting possibilities. I can have spearfish attacks sent. It's happened already in 2016 elections, except people were involved in constructing these spearfish attacks. But now, as we go on, it can be made a lot more automated. And that's the bigger worry, essentially.
Right. And then, so, that is just, who would have thought that at one point, like, you could have targeted attacks on one person and it would be effective as if you were targeting an entire group? That's just crazy. Like, I wouldn't, like, I'm relatively young and I could never have seen that before. Like, I always grew up with the internet. And that is such a distant concept to me, and now it's here. It's just...
Yeah, I think it is. Again, it's just a question of levels of, people at a certain age, people, me, are older than me, if they're not technologically literate, for them this whole thing is magic. Even Photoshop is magic. Okay, but for you, maybe some of this part looks like, oh my God, I didn't see it coming. But even people in the right smack dab in the middle of the technology, people are finding it is hard to predict. So, for example, we talked about this GPT-3 technology, which is, again, it turns out it's nothing. So there's this one company, supposedly originally non-profit, now it's become for-profit, called OpenAI, which basically started asking this question, okay, while people are trying to figure out better ways to learn the data, we will just do brute force and take the existing learning technology ideas, just increase their capacity in terms of the number of parameters that can be tuned, and then increase the data that is fed to them. And then the training steps, basically, you need to do many, many, many more training steps. And so you wind up increasing the compute power, the amount of GPUs, it turns out, the kind of operations that they do. Each operation is very cheap, but you need to do trillions of them, So they get these GPU technologies, and then they just did that. And they went with GPT, they generated GPT-1, 2, and GPT-2, when GPT-1 was there, it was making all sorts of mistakes, and then people were, this is not going to go anywhere. And the GPT-2 came, and people thought, oh my God, it already came so fast. And then they were still saying, oh, it's making all these mistakes, etc. I'm sure there is these problems, etc. And then GPT-3 came, and it essentially, like I think Guardian, for example, gave it like a prompt and made it write an op-ed, and they published it. And if, so again, the interesting thing is we are already, humans are not rational. It's like in some sense, we developed science, which is just amazing. But as a species, we are not particularly rational. We have all these biases. That's what Kahneman and Tversky made an entire career, the Nobel Prize, getting the Nobel Prize, showing all the irrationalities that we possess. And so what happens essentially is that you are likely to look at a story and believe it just because it looks plausible. Do you understand what I'm saying? In fact, in the very beginning of laser printers, we used to make this joke. And actually, I think Calvin Hobbes also has this thing that you can write junk, put it in like Word and print it on laser printer. It looks great, right? For a while, people will fall for it. And Calvin and Hobbes has this joke where this guy, makes up an entirely fake science report, and he says, "I have this great thing. I'll put clear plastic binder, and no teacher is immune to clear plastic binder on top of a report." And that's the kind of things that we fall for. It's just that we keep going. Now printed doesn't necessarily mean anything, but we still have these irrationalities. If it looks kind of plausible, we are likely to believe it. And this is basically is going to be exploited by these technologies. Again, this is a very interesting point to be made here. On one hand, the technologies are at a point that they can mislead us or make us suspend disbelief for a while, but they are not at all at a point where they are at the level of another human. You having a conversation with another human, seeing an actual, movie made by another human, etc. They're still far, far away. And that turns out that in fact those errors, those current failures, wind up giving us a leverage in detecting deep fakes. Like, I can tell whether it is a computer generated story. I can tell if it is a computer generated image by some telltale signs right now, because of what is the limitations of the current technology wind up telling us what is the, whether it is whether it's an image made by computer versus real. So this is almost the opposite of CAPTCHAs. When you go on to trying to get into any online service, they will show things to make sure that you're not a robot. Right, right. And the capture technology is becoming harder and harder to come up with to some extent. In the original days, AI technology was not enough to even cleanly see, a digit with some cross over it. But now those are actually easy captures. Eventually, captures will wind up, there is this issue that captures will become increasingly harder. I've seen this cartoon where the captchas will start doing integration by parts, for example, which to see whether or not. But then the problem is they have to become harder and harder. You have to look for the one little piece that is still the piece where that humans can do better and machines still cannot. And oftentimes it's this common sense that we have, it is the causal reasoning that we have that wind up being like a big giveaways right now. But as technology goes forward, it will be harder to tell, how far we will be able to catch that.
And that's good. And you suspect that there's going to be a point in time where that threshold is passed, correct? For
yes, I believe so. Right now, deepfakes can be detected. In fact, one of the things that AI Foundation that I was involved with, their nonprofit side, we have this thing called RD 2020, Reality Defender 2020. And, 6 months back, before the coronavirus, the biggest worry everybody had was how deepfakes are going to affect democracy and elections. We have other problems for democracy right now, but, that was still continues to be one more of the problems. And one of the things we were looking at is trying to pool the different technologies that are either developed by us or by others in detecting whether an image is fake versus real, whether a video is fake versus real. And then we basically have the service where the journalists can submit it to Reality Defender for verification, and then we'll give them some amount of information that we have on our confidence level as well as our explanations. And recently Microsoft actually got into partnership with this AI Foundation folks, and so they have this whole bigger thing with Microsoft tools also included in this. Now, the way those kinds of, in general, whether it's in RD 2020 or in research in general, the way the current detection technologies work is essentially, as I said, leveraging the failures of the current day AI technology. One of the things is they are pretty impressive. Like when they make a human face, you can't tell that they're not in fact, there's all sorts of things. There's a slide that I use in my talks where I show these two pictures, one of a man, one of a baby, and ask which one is a deep fake and which one is an actually photograph of a real person. And people have a hard time. And this was already 1 year back thing. And there's actually, I think, a website which would give you pairs of these, who is real website or something, which will give you pairs of images and ask you to guess which one is a fake. And it's already hard for most people to tell the difference. But some of the things that the kinds of detection technologies that you can use, for example, is oftentimes making the background consistent is much harder than just making the foreground correct. So I can make my face correct, but ensuring that the books behind me are actually making sense, the writing behind me is making sense, for example, that's much harder. Okay, and again, it's one of those things where if you have it, taking a picture, there's no thinking involved. If I'm making it from scratch, making the background is hard, which is why, interestingly enough, in cartoons, in animation, essentially, they wind up spending a lot more time on this, the background, and they'll try to do it in such a way that the background remains the same for many, many frames while the foreground changes. This is what we've figured out. But when the AI systems are coming up with the background as well as the foreground, they tend to make mistakes in the background. And you can catch on that. They tend to make mistakes at the pixel level statistics. That may not be clear to you, but would be clear to machines. So there are like two types of problems. One where the people themselves can tell. We are not worried about those kinds of problems. They'll realize that it's a fake. But then things that people can't tell, but the machines can tell. Things like micro variations in the pixel level statistics, micro variations in the voice signatures and the voice lip movement connection, and these kinds of things. In fact, somebody was pointing out that in the Obama video, somebody pointed out is actually you can tell it is a fake because there are certain the tells that real Obama has. He does certain things every once in a while, which this video doesn't capture, and so you can wind up using them to figure out, because each of these are harder and harder detection things. And currently, the best people are trying to do is to use crowdsourced competitions. Like Facebook has a big competition where they put together some number of fake images, some number of real images, and asking people to develop, take part in this competition, make your own machine learning classifier which tells which is fake versus real, and then we'll give you a badge. And people tend to do, this way you can get a lot more people to work on the problem. The tricky part with that is just like cybersecurity, when you have, companies which are trying to make sure that their machines won't be broken into, the viruses or the attacks that were known, we can defend against them. It's the ones that you don't know, the 0-day attacks. That's what, cybersecurity people call. The one that somebody made up very recently for which there is no detector. And so, in fact, to actually capture those, you almost need red teams where the good guys have a subset of them who act like the bad guys and come up with all sorts of ways to break the existing detectors. And then those will have to be thrown into the pool of the images or the text or the voices that you're trying to classify. So this is where we are. And as you can see, it's like a moving target. Eventually, I think there'll come a time where there's nothing you can tell from the signal perspective, from the visual signal, from the voice signal, from the written word signal perspective. You can't tell whether it is made up or actually written by a human agent. You will very quickly come to that, even with AI technology sitting behind you, right? And so at that point, the interesting question would be like two different issues. One, of course, is by that time, hopefully our vulnerability will reduce. We are not likely to believe everything. So in some weird sense, we will now be in a world we will no longer believe our eyes. It looks like an extremely hard thing to imagine right now. But my point is we have gotten used to lots and lots of things. 6 months back, we didn't know that we will be in a world where we'll be stuck in our homes like all the time, including interviews being done from the homes. Nobody would have believed it if I told you this is what is going to happen. And yet we gotten used to it. We are extremely, our irrationality, is sort of balanced by our adaptability. We can adapt to everything, okay? Many, many years back, centuries back, there'll be fewer people, and there'll be generally, you can trust the people on your block much more. So you've lost your purse, it fell on the road. You can be sure that if you come back, like 2 days later, it'll still be there. Okay, now you leave the person, the thing, in most places it will be gone within seconds. Now it's a very different world. Is it an extremely bad world? I mean, the old time folks will say, oh, good old days were better, but it's not clear. I mean, we are, if you are like a guy who really is into making sure that leaving a purse on the road and not losing is very, very much the apotheosis of civilization, then you will feel that the civilization has gone to dogs. But on the other hand, if you take good and the bad together, there's a lot more equality now. There's a lot more access now. There's a lot more many good things that are going on, and a few bad things are going on too. And so we get used to that. That's what is going to happen with this deepfake technology too. In the sense, we will then use all these good uses of synthetic reality, but then we'll be much more careful about just believing anything that we see, believing that anything that we hear. My joke is, you may very well, so before believing, then you might need a third party authentication. There's an entire branch of technology called cryptographic authentication technologies. Like, for example, when you go onto the web, you type CNN.com. In the old days, anybody can basically say, I'm CNN.com, and then they will start showing you the stories that are completely made up, and you think you are watching CNN. We figured out a way around it. Basically, we use HTTPS, which is essentially a way of making sure that that some third party is guaranteeing that you're actually seeing the site that the site says it is. You see what I'm saying? That sort of cryptographic authentication will need to be made for everything, for every photograph, every voice utterance, every written word, every video, every excerpt of the video, etc. Now, that looks like extremely hard thing to do right now, but it looked very hard to do this secure HTTPs before they were done. And, we will get to that. And so between we losing our vulnerability and believing everything, and we having the technology to essentially have a third-party authentication through cryptographic verification technologies, we will be fine. It may be less. Again, you would say that the world where I could leave a purse on the road is a much more romanticized world of good people. I'm not sure that is true. On that aspect, maybe. But I really don't want to live 100 years back just so that I would be able to lose my purse on the road. Okay, I want to live now because it's a much better world, like that Disney, Walt Disney thing. Now is the best time in a sense, and it might become better as we go forward. It's like our ability to, manage those both together. In general, the tricky part again will be the transition time. And I'm most worried to some extent about the transition time where people haven't yet developed robust, skepticism. They still, because we have always believed our eyes and the show me state or show me the proof. If I see it, I'll believe it. All of these are essentially like challenges. And, AI will say, sure, you want to see it? I will show it to you. Okay, somebody using the AI technology will show you what you want to see. And, you need to get out of that mindset in general. In fact, I think I remember this beautiful quote from this old show called Moonlighting, where this guy says, people would be much harder to fool if they didn't have eyes and ears to be sure with. Magic works because we trust our eyes. And the magicians know exactly what are the problems with our eyes, and they basically make sure that they exploit that. And that is going to be the same thing that's going to happen with respect to this, deep fakes. At some point of time, we will come to a scenario where we would lose that, we'll increase our skepticism, and then with this technology that's available. Up until then, I'm worried about the vulnerability. And so I keep thinking that the problem about deepfakes is not long-term future, because by then things will be different. By then we will lose our vulnerabilities, and there will be technologies to help us. It's now where we still haven't gotten, despite all these examples of fake news, etc., people still tend to believe their eyes. People tend to believe what they see. And one of the other sad parts of human irrationality is after I show you a fake video, after you see it, then if you were told it is fake, there are psychological studies showing that you still have been affected by seeing it, thinking it was real. So it actually changes. So there would be like, this bad video about this politician, you realize it is all completely fake later on, but it will still have this problem. I mean, this has been used, for example, in this beautiful article in New York Times yesterday about election integrity. There is really no problem, according to any scientific study, for example, about massive voter fraud in US, for example. Every possible case that people brought out, courts have found there was nothing wrong with them. And yet, you say enough of these cases and then come back and tell you, oh, they are fake. People will still tend to believe there is something wrong. That's a worrisome part about deepfakes right now. And so that's where we need to still learn how to cut them down before people become a lot more robust and a lot less vulnerable to them.
Okay. And so in this transition period, what are you most worried about?
I'm worried about everything. So I think my sense is that, well, I think, again, depending on the type of people, you would be, there is depending on your biases, you're more likely to believe certain kinds of stories, etc. And so this unholy combination of all of us having profiles on massive online services like Facebook, Twitter, etc. So you think nobody knows you, but oh my God, everybody knows about you. I mean, at least everybody who has access to Facebook databases will know about you. And so we can easily leverage that. I'm worried about that combined with deepfakes. That's like a very worrisome possibility. One of the things that actually has to happen is, again, advertisement technology, of any kind, used our irrationalities against us, right? In any kind against us, and that's why everything is $4.99, and so people like me think, oh, it's only $4 plus something, and the only way, and actually when I first came to US many years back, I still completely fall for this. I should know. I had an engineering degree, but the irrationalities it takes much harder, much more practice to get out of the human irrationalities that are built in for us, that worked for us in our evolution. One of the reasons I found, for example, when talking to my friends from US, that in their very elementary schools, they are taught that $4.99, you better think of it as $5. Okay, otherwise you're screwed. This is what I'm saying. Nobody told me this, and so I fell for it much more easily, and then I had to slowly learn it myself. So in some sense, there is an education aspect to it. Given that this technology exists, we need to teach in the transition period to our kids, even though they are the less. Although I'm actually more worried about the older folks. Unfortunately, they don't go to schools. But at least for the kids, we can teach them, don't trust everything you see, don't trust everything you hear. So what I'm really more worried about is the older folks who think they know everything, right? And they trust their eyes, they trust their ears. And, the classic thing is, don't tell me, I know what I've seen. Whenever you hear this, you know that the other person is a bozo to some extent in this day and age, because you don't know what you have seen. That was like good old days where you thought you knew what you saw. We already seen that there are so many problems with the fallacies in the human memory, human visual vision, human auditory perception, etc. The courts have always shown that the greatest, most confident witnesses are actually wrong about what they have seen. This was when nobody was out to get them. But now, I'm actually making up an entire scenario and making you a witness to it. And you, of course, believe that you've seen this. And that's just wrong, right? And so I'm much more worried about how the bias that you already have based on your prior beliefs is going to wind up making you, it predisposes you into believing certain kinds of stories, and that can be very easily weaponized. very, very easily weaponized. And that's what I'm most worried about, honestly. Yeah.
So we're a little bit over. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure, that's fine. Actually, I have some time. We can do
okay.
whatever you want.
Okay.
Fine, yeah.
So in you're the perfect person to ask for this. In the larger conversation of AI,
Okay.
In particular, like, I personally am pretty hopeful about all the benefits that AI will bring. And things like the automation is going to take people's jobs. I think there's going to be the ability for people to adapt in that way. But what scares me so much about this topic in particular is the idea of who you are being deconstructed and rebuilt by this technology is much scarier to me than this dystopian kind of, you mentioned Yuval Noah Harari, his ideas of AI melding with humanity and things like that. Those are, I guess, a little bit not as terrifying to me as just who we are and what we believe. So what do you think? Do you think that synthesized reality is one of the more, in terms of AI as a whole, is it one of the more important things to, I guess, get right than other areas?
So I'm sorry. So you are trying to basically point out that, if I get you correctly, the question of who you are is being redefined by the synthetic versions of you.
Right.
Yeah, that is indeed very much an interesting question. So my joke on this, I mostly think in terms of jokes, that there used to be, when Charlie Chaplin was alive, there used to be this Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest. And there is an apocryphal story that real Charlie Chaplin took part in a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest in Denmark or something and came in second. Okay, and I tend to think that in future we'll all be Charlie Chaplins, coming in second to our reconstructed versions. Because one of the most interesting things is, this becomes philosophical. If you have three friends, they already have three different personas that they attribute to you. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's like, first of all, nobody thinks they're a bad guy, right? So everybody basically has their own persona. They think that is their person. But then really, perception is reality. It's what your friends think of you that defines you rather than what you think of yourself, right? Now, all three of your friends might have very different personas, right? They might be thinking, for example, one friend of mine will be thinking, Rav is really a very good, funny guy, tells nice, good jokes. And a synthetic reality of me, which actually tells real jokes, good jokes, might be better for them than me, because I'm not such a good teller of jokes. But it's this issue of, in fact, this is the word that I was looking for earlier, confirmation bias. They have a predisposed, they had the prior notion that, we think Rav has this property. And a synthetic reality of me, whether it's less important whether I actually have that property, the real Rav has that property. If the synthetic reality depiction of me that is shown to this person has that property, they'll say, yes, that's exactly, I remember Rav, this is exactly the kind of things he does. You can talk about jokes, you can talk about lies, you can talk about making fun of people, anything. Some friends like me, some enemies dislike me, and I can make variations of my synthetic, a third party can make variations of my synthetic self and present it to all of these people, and they would much rather live with them than with me. In fact, there's a beautiful movie about this. I should remember this. It's a very lovely movie where the man basically passes away, and it's a sort of a mind twin of it, an embodied mind twin of it is created, and the wife starts to know in the beginning. She knows this in the beginning. It was created and it was not a real person. But as the movie goes on, she starts actually liking this version of the person than the real guy. to some extent, because in some sense this thing adapts to what you want me to be, in essence. And this basically does, it's just an extension of the extension of the same issue. You look at the world through your confirmation biases, you look at your world through your prior beliefs, and if they conform to it, you'll say, yeah, that must be right. You look at people who are part of the world through the same sort of confirmation biases. If I think a certain politician is a crook, then you show me a version, a synthetic reality depiction of the politician, of them doing crooked things, I'm more likely to believe it. Right? And then I would actually say, if I show me two videos, one of the real guy, one of this made up version of them who has these properties that I believe they have, I'm going to go with the made up one. And so this is going to be an interesting thing. We have already had this. Again, one of the most beautiful things to me, as somebody who's been working in AI for like, God knows how long, 35 years, is most amazing philosophical questions that we have worried about are no longer philosophical questions. They are like real questions, right? In the sense, if you think of Akira Kurosawa's Rashomon, where the same story has been seen by 12 people and they have 12 different, 7 people or something, and they have very different views of what happened. What is reality? We knew this already. At least the thing actually happened. In the case of Ran, in that case of that movie, basically there's a one objective thing happened, but then multiple subjective people were looking at it and making their own versions of it. Imagine Akira Kurosawa on steroids, where there are 70,000 people, each 1,000 people were shown a different version of the reality, who then will then make 1,000 different sensations, mental models of the reality that they've been shown. They, have this, what used to be like a philosophical problem that we don't have to worry about is smack dab in the middle of our daily life now. Okay.
It's so crazy. And then with that in particular, you seem very hopeful about this whole situation in a lot of ways. And the idea that we will be able to adapt to a new life with all these different parts coming from AI, is that a good thing for humanity? Or is it kind of up in the air if it's good or not?
I think it is, again, first of all, that whole issue it's just the same worries that we had all through human civilization, just on steroids. Everything is faster, everything is accelerated right now. So people were talking about this at the time of Industrial Revolution. People were talking about this when they come out of caves, and basically saying, is this going to be a good thing on the whole or a bad thing on the whole? To me, the fact that we are asking that questions is good. Okay. In the sense that we are putting some level of deliberation. We are inventing the future we are going to live in. Not completely determined. We as a whole, the entire humanity together, is inventing the future we're going to live in. And the fact that we are having these open dialogues about this is to me a very hopeful sign. That certainly wasn't the case at the time of Industrial Revolution. That certainly wasn't the case at the time of many of the huge cataclysmic changes in the society in the old days. As bad as we think the current times are, they are probably the most democratic times. Everybody has a voice. It is true that more people than actual real people in the world have voices. They have more Twitter accounts, which are bots and so on. But people do have a voice. People actually have the ability to push back, the ability to look at whether or not something is working, look at trying to consider, maybe going slower on it. So those are positive things. But having said that, I would also say that the moat for this technology is very shallow. Okay, so for example, the last time we had thought about this quite a bit was nuclear bombs. How to make sure that we will do, only peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And we had all these NPTs, nuclear non-proliferation, NNPTs, I guess, nuclear non-proliferation treaties, and so on, and we could enforce them. We, meaning quote unquote, all the good guys of the world, good people of the world, could enforce them. They essentially in some reasonable way to make sure that rogue actors, rogue states are not going to get this. We had trouble doing that, but we tried reasonably. Part of the reason we could do that is because the moat for generating and developing a nuclear bomb, the technological moat for developing a nuclear bomb is extremely high. Okay, so for example, you can cut off access to uranium, you can cut off access to heavy water, you can cut off access to a whole bunch of things, and then that particular rogue actor or rogue state will have a harder time making the nuclear technology, which is exactly the reason why, despite the fact that it's been more than 60 years, there are only so few countries which actually have nuclear bombs. They had to reach a certain level of technological maturity. That thinking doesn't work as well for AI. Because to some extent, as I mentioned to you, this sort of generating synthetic, it's a lot more of, instead of one big nuclear bomb, it is a huge number of pinpricks that lots and lots of people can generate. And everybody has access to synthetic reality technology. That's sort of one of the things that's already happening technically in the field of AI is whether or not much of this technology should be open or not. On one hand, people like me in the universities who believe in the openness of research want everything to be open. I want everything to be open. So in fact, an OpenAI, when it generated GPT-3 like 6 months back, I think they basically first said it's so dangerous that we are not going to give access to the technology to anybody. And we basically were all, making fun of them, saying this is nonsensical. Essentially, it's like almost you're creating publicity for yourself by saying this, But I mean, there's both sides, but at least, they tried to do that to some extent. But very quickly, it turns out that anybody has access to these kinds of technologies right now. So last year, for example, around November timeframe, there was this cell phone app called Zao, ZAO. It's basically, if you have it on your cell phone, then using the cell phone camera, you can essentially insert yourself into your favorite movie. Okay, it was meant to be like for entertainment purposes, but the fact that a silly old cell phone can be used by anybody who has no idea of technology to insert themselves to movies tells you that's like a real small tip of the huge iceberg of the potential uses as well as misuses for that app, right? And so it's surprisingly actually like China just sort of basically made that app illegal, and then they removed it very quickly. But now they still, I think the one that I mentioned about Gal Gadot, being put into the Wonder Woman, etc. This technology is available. It's, you can see it as a big positive, and it's a democratic nature of the technology. What that also means is non-proliferation is going to be a different game for AI technology than for nuclear non-proliferation technology. You have to essentially detect rather than stop the spread. It's not that easy to stop the spreads. For example, today, so there's already regulation, like California has regulation about deepfakes and various, media organizations will basically not print deepfake things. I think you were mentioning just before when we were talking that this ad made by this company, essentially, which they admit is a deepfake ad, but they want to show it, and many media organizations don't want to let it be run. That's currently true here, but that's currently the world is, this is previously each country was like a sort of almost a hermeneutically sealed place with very little connection with the rest of the world. Right now, that's not true. if basically North Korea makes something that's available in US without your knowledge, with all the technology, with all the anonymization technology, with all the VPN technology, etc., that technology available here. And if a technology is made open here and they misuse it, they can do that too. And so saying ban X just doesn't work. Ban, who is going to ban? Who is going to be the good guys? The good guys will basically stop using deepfakes, let's say. What happens to the people who would not want to go by those rules? I mean, I would love to live in a world where everybody follows the rules, but we know that that's no longer true, and so you have to take into account the possibility that this technology is easily available and people will misuse it. And so you need to play the defense game instead of banning game. Okay, you have to defend against synthetic reality. And that's sort of thing that is for something like, the things like this RD 2020 that I mentioned earlier, etc. That's the thing that they take. And basically it's an interesting world right now because the barriers between countries and societies have disappeared. Because of which, the fact that you have decided not to use deepfakes, I have decided not to use deepfakes in Tempe. So if I say tomorrow Tempe downtown is a motor-free zone, I can enforce that. Okay, because people from North Korea or China or India can't flout that. They have to come here to actually flout it. If on the other hand we say Tempe is going to be a deepfake-free zone, that's actually kind of being naive. Because if Tempe has internet, then it has the same internet as the rest of the world. It may well be that Tempe government and the Tempe citizens at least are not generating these deepfakes, but somebody else who generates these deepfakes somewhere else, they're accessible to you like with a click. And we are also sort of leveraging that. We also speak on both sides of our mouths. Places like Facebook, on one hand, want to use this. I mean, they don't mind who is paying for the ad. That's the problem that they got themselves into. And it was clearly, as long as you take the precaution of having a name that doesn't sound too Russian and you look more like a Midwest person than a Russian person, which is exactly what the most recently they removed a whole bunch of Twitter accounts from Russian misinformation campaign, and they all had basically the quote-unquote Midwestern names and faces, okay, of people who don't exist, essentially. And so when you do that, then they will basically be able to still spread this information. And that's the fact that the moat is shallow, to misuse this technology is something that's quite a worrisome thing. And the knee-jerk reaction that let's ban is missing the point. So speaking for myself, I'm in one of these places where on one hand, I'm acutely aware of the dangers of this technology, but on the other hand, I don't believe that banning is going to work. Education, defense, these are things that are going to work. You're educating the people not to fall for things. Developing technologies, probably supported by AI itself, to defend, to basically detect fake reality as long as it happens. And then at some point of time, then we will get to a point where we don't trust anybody until they're cryptographically authenticated. And then we will get to that point. Of course, I have to admit that if we get to a point where quantum computers are real, cryptographic authentication protocols can be broken in polynomial time. And so there that goes. That's an entirely different question. But to me, again, I still feel more comfortable with this world than the world we had with thermonuclear weapons. One stupid guy, one stupid person can annihilate the civilization with the thermonuclear weapon. So it's like, this is my point, that people are worried about autonomy. Autonomy is not the problem. Autonomy we already had. Stupid autonomy is basically you have laser-guided missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles that can be sent by some rogue actor and they'll just come fall on some, heartland town and annihilate it. I'm much more worried about that. This one is many, many more people have access, but it is also something that we can essentially, the old Reagan Star Wars defense initiative that I don't know, you seem very young, but I was alive and I remember laughing at it at that time. But you could have a variation of the Star Wars defense initiative for AI deepfakes, sorts of things, which is basically how do we fight against them, knowing that people will misuse them. It's a different asymmetric warfare right now on misinformation happens.
It's a really interesting way to look at it because it seems like from now in the Cold War, it's the same actors that are in this kind of struggle, but then the goal was to just destroy the other one so that your ideology progresses, and now it's almost like you're building the future of your own ideology instead of destroying it.
It's a much smarter thing, right? Because it's so much better for me to, I remember actually, in fact, this is kind of a gory thing to talk about, but I remember there was a type of weapons that would keep the buildings intact but will kill people. The usual chemical weapons kind of things, right? If you had your brothers, right, that would be better than leveling the whole city. If you are an enemy, right, you can use the city. You just don't want the people in it, right? Even better is you don't mind keeping the city as well as the people. You just want to change their minds, right? If I change your mind, then you already believe this is going back to the very beginning of our discussion. If I basically make you believe this reality I want you to believe in, this shared reality that I'm going to, shared imagination that I'm going to, make it. If you believe in it, then it doesn't matter to me that you are from X culture versus Y culture. You are essentially, you are in my cult now. Okay, and so I'll get the entire city along with, people who agree with me. And that would be an interesting, that's happening like right now. Again, I think, in fact, even thinking in terms of one country against another is to course a level of discussion right now. We are actually, in some weird sense, technology has led us into our own bubbles. People talk about filter bubbles in Facebook. In the good old days, you could either buy Washington Post or Washington Examiner if you are in Washington DC. Okay, if you are a some mainstream democratic kind of a guy, you'll get the Washington Post, and then the Republican kind of a guy, you'll get the Washington Examiner. It's only half believe in one, half believe in the other. Now there are like a gazillion different sources which all put their own spin on the reality, and there are enough sets of cults and people who believe in each pieces of it, and so each of them are trying to, QAnon is trying to make you believe in QAnon. It's not Russia necessarily, it could be just your friends, who want you to believe in this new religion. Okay, so it's even warfare, even this issue of the very human issue of taking over bigger and bigger chunks of the world for ourselves is happening at a different level of granularity than before. You don't have to do it, it's like this 1991 or 93, the Bush-Iraq war, war of hearts and minds, winning hearts and minds. They didn't actually know how to do it. Now we have the way to win hearts and minds by messing with mental models. In fact, one of the ultimate things is my own research in my lab, in addition to this, my involvement in AI Foundation, my own research is this human AI interaction. And to me, the biggest thing to get AI systems to interact with you is for them to be able to reason with your mental models. But then if they can reason with your mental models and change your mental models, then you don't have to shoot a gun. You never have to, bomb a city. You don't have to shoot a gun. They just basically, if you change people's mental model, they'll do what you want. Right? So the biggest fakes are not deep fakes, they're head fakes. Think about it that way. If I can head fake you into thinking religion, a particular made up religion, a particular made up ideology, then I have complete control over you. There is no bloodshed. All the buildings are as good as ever. You built them, I use them, but you will just talk like me right now. And then somebody else will probably head fake me, and then this will continue at different levels. And so this is an entirely different aspect of the aggression doesn't have to be at the country and continental level. It can be very much more diffuse. It can be between any subset of people and any other subset of people, who want you to believe in their view of the world. And they have the access to that right now. And that's the brave new part of the brave new world that we are getting into. So.
That is it's such a great way of looking at it in a way, because at the end of the day, I would much rather have someone try to change my mind than to kill me, which is it's almost
that's
like
interesting. It's actually interesting that you say that.
It's
interesting
very
that you can
democratic in a way.
What?
You know what I mean? It's I want you to believe this, so here's it's more manipulative, but it is very democratic.
No, actually, no. That's my. In fact, I would. In fact, I'm surprised that you say that. The reality ultimately is I can do a lot more by changing your mind. Again, the word, just like the phrase deep fakes only has negative meaning in colloquial English, even though it's really just a name for synthetic reality, which can have positive uses. The phrase changing mind only has positive connotation, because we normally associated changing one's mind with cogent arguments, which follow some beautiful rules that the human civilization believed in. You don't make up things to make you believe in an argument. You basically you come up with, how do I convince somebody of my position? That's all logic. That's what Greeks were talking about, logic, before Christ. And so we basically, that is the changing mind. But just as changing minds currently has positive thing, but I can change your mind by messing with your neurons, let's say. That's also changing mind. The English word changing mind essentially involves that too, okay? And changing minds by messing with your neurons directly is one type, and that you will really see it's very bad. But changing minds by representing a reality that doesn't exist, okay, to you, by basically telling you a lie, right? That is, I don't think you would agree that that is a fair thing. It's not at all democratic. That's not at all democratic. It's really a very interesting question. We do this all the time. In fact, one of the most interesting things is that, as I said, in my research, I talk about human AI interaction. AI systems have to interact. For them to interact well with us, they have to mental model. Okay, because otherwise, we basically, remember that that's basically social intelligence. What we call social intelligence is the ability for you to realize that each of us have different belief systems, and that what you know may or may not be known to me. And in fact, there's this beautiful experiment in psychology, well-known experiment called the Sally-Ann study, Sally-Ann experiment. And that basically shows that kids don't come into this world knowing that what they believe in may not be believed in by others. They think that if they know something, everybody else will know that. So the way this experiment goes is Sally comes into a room, and you are the observer, and the kid is the observer, and the kid is being told, Sally came into the room, there is a ball in the red, in front of her you put a ball in the red bucket, okay, and the bucket is down so you can't see where it is, and then Sally goes out, then Anne comes in, takes the ball, you're still seeing all this, takes the ball from under the red bucket and puts under the yellow bucket. Okay, then Anne goes out, then Sally comes in, then you ask the kid, where do you think Sally is going to look for her ball? Extremely silly question, hopefully for all of us. But kids below 4 years, they have a hard time telling. For example, they will think that since they know that the ball is under the yellow bucket, everybody else knows it. So in fact, when kids come into this world, they think, apparently, there is a theory that says that they think that the entire world is connected to their body. So it's like a huge, large body. And so they don't realize that their body ends and other bodies start, etc. in the beginning. And then that they get out of very fast. But until 4 or 5, they still think the minds are fused. So if they know something, everybody else knows it. Do you understand what I'm saying? And after 4, they realize. That's why it's so cute when kids start telling lies. I mean, I make this joke that as an AI guy, I was ecstatic when my son was able to tell his first lie because I knew he had a working brain. Because to be able to actually tell a lie, it's harder cognitively than telling the truth. In fact, there's this beautiful book, An Autistic Kid. I think there's this lovely novel, I think The Curious Case of A Dog in the Night or something, where this autistic kid says, I don't know how people tell lies. At any given point of time, one thing happened, a trillion things didn't happen. If you want to tell a lie, you have to pick between these trillion things that didn't happen. It's so much simpler to just tell what happened. And the reality is telling a lie requires higher level of intelligence. And we have always realized that we have the ability to do that. And that is part of our ability to tell stories to each other, etc. But we have also developed these ethics, saying in certain cases, you won't do this. So I tell in my class to my students that integrity is knowing that you can cheat, but choosing not to. Okay, I don't want brain dead people who don't even know that Google exists. Every possible question I can ask you, the answer is available somewhere in the world. Integrity is choosing not to exercise that part of your intelligence because we believed this is a social contract we established. When you start changing minds by telling lies, which is very much possible with AI systems, then you may be starting. You may no longer say, "Oh, that's much better than being bombed." Yes, in some sense, yes, but in some sense, no. So, for example, a patient who loses their entire brain, Alzheimer's patients, are they alive or not? In some sense, what are you other than your memories and your belief systems? And if I change those, then are you really there? And it's a very, again, as I said, these are philosophical questions that used to be academic questions, but these are going to be things that we will have to deal with. Much of the misinformation campaigns only change minds, but changed minds have consequences. But that minds are not being changed in what we agree as reasonable ways. It's essentially minds are being changed with misinformation. And so that if you look at it that way, you won't be as happy that everybody can. So, in the past, only few people had the ability to, put a bomb and throw a bomb on you. Now everybody has the ability to tell a lie to you. And they don't even have to come in front of you and tell a lie. They can just sort of intercede in the news that you're looking into and make you look at, a wrong version of the reality. And that becomes an interesting issue. So we actually did this experiment in our research. It was a referred paper last year about how. So it's clear that AI systems have to do mental modeling and should be able to affect your mental model to interact with you. As we are talking to each other right now, we are constantly trying to figure out what you are thinking, what I am thinking, and how far to push each other in different directions, etc. This is part of social intelligence. If AI systems don't have that, it's sort of like talking to an autistic savant. One of the interesting things is, that people talk about is in many cases of autism, their cognitive intelligence is the same as everybody's. But their social intelligence, that's something that we take for granted, unfortunately is affected. And while you never get a job for your social intelligence, you keep one because of it. Because you start, doing things that people don't feel comfortable around you anymore, then you no longer have a job. So this social intelligence part is important for us to deal with AI systems in our day-to-day lives when they're trying to help us. But then when they have those capabilities, they can use them against you. They can tell you lies. If I'm changing your mind, I can change your mind by telling the truth. I can change your mind by telling the lie. And the question then, and then one of the trickier parts is human society is already made up of. It's not the case that we say no lies are allowed. In fact, there are lots and lots of mythological stories in every culture which basically point out there are good lies and there are bad lies. It's like a greater good can sometimes be reached by telling a lie. And there are all sorts of interesting philosophical things. And to some extent, the social fabric depends on white lies. If anybody ever asks you, am I looking fat? The answer is no, obviously, right? Because if you say yes or something, then you won't have them as your friend. So it's like the entire social fabric depends on white lies. So the question we asked in this research was, if AI system were to tell these lies as against the humans, would it affect your would people be more worried being told white lies by other humans versus AI systems? Interestingly, it turns out that once they realize it's a white lie, as of now, in our work, as of now, basically, they are much more worried if they find that it's the AI system which told a white lie as against a human. You see what I'm saying? But that might very well change. And so in some sense, these